with learning and memory, and this fabulous demonstration, knock out that gene and you have a mouse that doesn't learn as well. Ooh, a genetic basis for intelligence. What was much less appreciated in that landmark study that got picked up by the media left and right is take those genetically impaired mice and raise them in a much more enriched, stimulating environment than your normal mice in a lab cage, and they completely overcame that deficit. So when one says in a contemporary sense that, oh, this behavior is genetic, to the extent that that's even a valid sort of phrase to use, what you're saying is there is a genetic contribution to how this organism responds to environment. Genes may influence the readiness with which an organism will deal with a certain environmental challenge. You know, that's not the version most people have in their minds. And not to be too soapboxing, but run with the old sort of version of it's genetic, and it's not that far from a history of eugenics and things of that sort. It's a widespread misconception, and it's a potentially fairly dangerous one.
One reason that the sort of biological explanation for violence, one reason that hypothesis is potentially dangerous, it's not just misleading, it can really do harm, is because if you believe that, you could very easily say, well, there's nothing we can do to change the predisposition people have to becoming violent. All we can do if somebody becomes violent is punish them, lock them up or execute them. But we don't need to worry about changing the social environment or the social preconditions that may lead people to become violent, because that's irrelevant.
The genetic argument allows us the luxury of ignoring past and present historical and social factors. And in the words of Louis Menand, he wrote in the New Yorker, very astutely, he said, "It's all in the genes, an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should someone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere," which is a good way of putting it. So the genetic argument is simply a cop-out, which allows us to ignore the social and economic and political factors that in fact underlie many troublesome behaviors. Addictions are usually considered to be a drug-related issue, but looking at it more broadly, I define addiction as any behavior that is associated with craving, with temporary relief, and with long-term negative consequences, along with an impairment of control over it, so that the person wishes to give it up or promises to do so, but can't follow through. And when you understand that, then you can see that there are many more addictions than simply those related to drugs. So there's workaholism, there's addiction to shopping, to the internet, to video games. There's the addiction to power. People have power, but they want more and more and more. Nothing is ever enough for them. Acquisition, corporations that must own more and more. The addiction to oil, or at least to the wealth and to the products made accessible to us by oil. Look at the negative consequences on the environment. We're destroying the very earth that we inhabit for the sake of that addiction. Now, these addictions are far more devastating in their social consequences than the cocaine or heroin habits of my downtown East Side patients. Yet they're rewarded and considered to be respectable. The tobacco company executive that shows a higher profit will get a much bigger reward. He doesn't face any negative consequences legally or otherwise. In fact, he's a respected member of the board of several other corporations. But tobacco smoke-related diseases kill 5.5 million people around the world every year. In the United States, they kill 400,000 people a year. And these people are addicted to what? To profit. To such a degree are they addicted that they're actually in denial about the impact of their activities, which is typical for addicts, is denial. And that's a respectable one. It's respectable to be addicted to profit no matter what the cost. So what is acceptable and what is respectable is a highly arbitrary phenomenon in our society. And it seems like the greater the harm, the more respectable the addiction. There's a general myth that drugs in themselves are addictive. In fact, the war on drugs is predicated on the idea that if you interdict the sources of drugs, you can deal with addiction that way. Now, if we understand addiction in a broader sense, we see that nothing in itself is addictive. No substance, no drug is by itself addictive, and no behavior is by itself addictive. Many people can go shopping without becoming shopaholics. Not everybody becomes a food addict. Not everyone who drinks a glass of wine becomes an alcoholic. So the real issue is what makes people susceptible, because it's the combination of a susceptible individual and the potentially addictive substance or behavior that actually then makes for full flowering of addiction. In short, it's not the drug that's addictive, it's the question of the susceptibility of the individual to being addicted to a particular substance or behavior. If we wish to understand what then makes some people susceptible, we actually have to look at their life experience. The old idea, although it's old, but it's still broadly held, that addictions are due to some genetic cause is simply scientifically untenable. What the case is actually is that certain life experiences make people susceptible. Life experiences that not only shape the person's personality and psychological needs, but also their very brains in certain ways. And that process begins in utero. It's been shown, for example, that if you stress mothers during pregnancy, their children are more likely to have traits that predispose them to addictions. And that's because development is shaped by the psychological and social environment. So the biology of human beings is very much affected by and programmed by their life experiences beginning in utero.
Environment does not begin at birth. Environment begins as soon as you have an environment. As soon as you are a fetus, you are subject to whatever information is coming through mom's circulations, hormones, levels of nutrients. Great landmark example of this, something called the Dutch hunger winter. 1944, Nazis occupying Holland. For a bunch of reasons, they decide to take all the food and divert it to Germany. For 3 months, everybody there is starving. Tens of thousands of people starve to death. What the Dutch hunger winter effect is, if you were a second or third trimester fetus during the starvation, your body learned something very unique during that time. As it turns out, second, third trimester, something that your body is going about trying to learn about the environment is, well, how menacing of a place is it out there? How plentiful? How much nutrients am I getting by way of mom's circulation? Be a fetus who is starving during that time, and your body programs forever after to be really, really, really stingy with your sugar and fat, and what you do is you store every bit of it. Be a Dutch hunger winter fetus, and half a century later, everything else being equal, you are more likely to have high blood pressure, obesity, or metabolic syndrome. That is environment coming in a very unexpected place.
You can stress animals in a laboratory when they're pregnant, and their offspring will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol as adults. You can stress human mothers. For example, in a British study, women who are abused in pregnancy will have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol in their placenta at birth, and their children are more likely to have conditions that predispose them to addictions by age 7 or 8. So in utero stress already prepares the ground for all kinds of mental health issues. Israeli study done prior on children born to mothers who were pregnant prior to the onset of the 1967 war. These women, of course, are very stressed, and their offspring have a higher incidence of schizophrenia than the average cohort. So there's plenty of evidence now that prenatal effects have a huge impact on the developing human being. The point about human development, and specifically human brain development, is that it occurs mostly under the impact of the environment and mostly after birth. Now, if you compare us to a horse, which can run on the first day of life, we see that we are very undeveloped. We can't muster that much neurological coordination, balance, muscle strength, visual acuity until a year and a half, 2 years. And that's because the brain development that in the horse happens in the safety of the womb, in a human being has to happen after birth. And that has to do with simple evolutionary logic. As the head gets larger, which is what makes us into human beings, the burgeoning of the forebrain is what creates the human species, actually. At the same time, we walk on two legs, so our pelvis narrows to accommodate that. So now we have a narrower pelvis, a larger head. Bingo, we have to be born prematurely. And that means that the brain development that in other animals occurs in utero, in us, occurs after birth. And much of that under the impact of the environment. And the concept of neural Darwinism simply means that the circuits that get the appropriate input from the environment will develop optimally, and the ones that don't will either not develop optimally or perhaps not at all. If you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room for 5 years, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life, because the circuits of vision require light waves for their development. And without that, even the rudimentary circuits present and active at birth will atrophy and die, and new ones will not develop. There's a significant way in which early experiences shape adult behavior, and even and especially early experiences for which there's no recall memory. It turns out that there are two kinds of memory. There is explicit memory, which is recall. This is when you can call back facts, details, episodes, circumstances. But the structure in the brain, which is called the hippocampus, which encodes recall memory, it doesn't even begin to develop fully until 1.5 years, and it's not fully developed until much later, which is why hardly anybody has any recall memory prior to 18 months. But there's another kind of memory, which is called implicit memory, which is in fact an emotional memory, where the emotional impact and the interpretation that the child makes of those emotional experiences is ingrained in the brain in the form of nerve circuits ready to fire without specific recall. So to give you a clear example, people who are adopted have a lifelong sense of rejection very often. They can't recall the adoption, they can't recall the separation from birth mother, because there's nothing there to recall with. But the emotional memory of separation and rejection is deeply embedded in their brains. Hence, they're much more likely to experience a sense of rejection and a great emotional upset when they perceive themselves as being rejected than other people. That's not unique to people who are adopted, but it's particularly strong in them because of this function of implicit memory. People who are addicted, given that they, according to all the research literature, certainly in my experience, the hardcore addicts virtually were all significantly abused as children or suffered severe emotional loss. Their emotional or implicit memories are those of a world that's not safe and not helpful, caregivers who are not to be trusted, and relationships that are not safe enough to open up to vulnerably. And hence their responses tend to be to keep themselves separate from really intimate relationships, not to trust caregivers, doctors and other people who are trying to help them, and generally see the world as an unsafe place. And that's strictly a function of implicit memory, which sometimes has to do with incidents they don't even recall. Infants who are born premature are often in incubators and various types of gadgetry and machinery for weeks and perhaps months. It's now known that if these children are touched and stroked on the back for just 10 minutes a day, that promotes their brain development. So human touch is essential for development. And in fact, infants who are never picked up will actually die. That's how much of a fundamental need being held is to human beings. In our society, there's an unfortunate tendency to tell parents not to pick up their kids, not to hold them, not to pick up babies who are crying for fear of spoiling them, or to encourage them to sleep through the night. You don't pick them up, which is just the opposite of what the child needs. And these children might go back to sleep because they give up and their brains just shut down as a way of defending against the vulnerability of being abandoned really by their parents. But their implicit memories will be that of a world that doesn't give a damn.
A lot of these differences are structured very early in life. In a way, if you like, the parental experience of adversity, how tough life is or how easy it is passed on to children. whether through maternal depression or parents being bad-tempered with their kids because they've had a hard day or just being too